The woods were my sanctuary. My name's Ethan. I'm 32, a software developer who spends most of his time glued to a screen, fingers tapping away at keys in a dim apartment. After my messy breakup, my hikes through the dense Vermont forests were the only thing that brought me peace. Every weekend, I'd drive out to the trailhead, lace up my boots, and lose myself in the woods. Friends called me reckless for hiking alone. Even my ex had argued about it. But to me, the solitude was liberating. It was my way to clear my mind, to reconnect with something real. The way the dense canopy of leaves filtered the sunlight, the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil, and the distant sound of a woodpecker tapping on some distant tree. It all felt like the antidote to the static monotony of my daily life. But there was one hike, one day, that made me question everything. The day I almost didn't make it back. It was supposed to be just another ordinary hike, another few hours to lose myself and emerge renewed. Instead, it turned into something I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. It started like any other Saturday. The sun barely peeked over the treetops as I parked my car, the early morning mist hanging thick between the trunks. The chill of dawn still lingered in the air, and I took a moment to savor it, letting it fill my lungs. I shouldered my pack, feeling the familiar weight settle against my back, took a deep breath of the crisp air, and started on my usual path. My boots found their rhythm quickly, the crunch of the gravel trail underfoot blending with the distant calls of birds waking up. After a couple of hours, though, something caught my eye. A faded wooden sign, half hidden by vines. The lettering was barely legible, worn by years of weather. I'd walked this trail dozens of times but had never noticed it before. Maybe the seasons had finally pulled enough foliage away. Or maybe I had just never looked closely enough. It pointed down a narrower, less trodden path, the kind that seemed to invite only those who weren't afraid of losing their way. I felt a sudden pull, a strange curiosity to explore. It was as if the woods were whispering, daring me to venture deeper. There was a certain thrill to the unknown, a sense of adventure that made me forget my usual rules. The kind of thrill that makes you feel alive, even when you know you shouldn't take the risk. I took the new path. The air seemed to grow denser, the light dimmer as the trees closed in overhead. The usual forest sounds faded until it was almost unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for any sound. I pushed forward, my boots crunching softly against the carpet of pine needles, the scent of damp earth growing stronger. The trail was narrow, winding between thick trunks that seemed to grow closer with every step. It felt different from my usual hikes, like this part of the forest didn't want me there. After another half hour, I saw him, an older man standing off to the side of the path. He looked out of place, his clothes dirty, but not in the way of a fellow hiker, more like he'd been living out there. His eyes were hollow, dark shadows under them like he hadn't slept in days. His appearance startled me. It was like he had emerged from the woods themselves, a part of the scenery until he decided to move. He stepped into the path, raising one hand slightly, palm out. "You shouldn't go any further," he said, his voice raspy. The way he spoke, it sounded less like a warning and more like a command. I asked why, but he just shook his head, his eyes shifting past me, as if he was afraid of something further down the trail. "Just turn around," he muttered, then stepped back into the trees, disappearing almost as quickly as he had appeared. I watched him until he vanished from sight, the unease in my gut tightening. There was something so off about him, something that whispered danger, but the stubborn part of me, the part that hated being told what to do, made me continue. I hesitated, the unease settling like a stone in my stomach. Every instinct told me to turn back, to get out while I could, but something, whether pride or stupidity, made me continue. I told myself it was just some old hermit trying to scare me off his turf, probably living out here to avoid people, and I wasn't going to let him spook me. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest seemed. The light barely filtered through the thick canopy above, and the air grew colder. A couple more hours passed, the path winding deeper into unfamiliar terrain, until I stumbled upon a campsite. The tent was collapsed, Its poles snapped, the fabric stained and torn. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Belongings were strewn about, a half-empty backpack, a sleeping bag, a scattered deck of cards, an old lantern tipped on its side. I felt like I was intruding, like I was stepping into someone else's forgotten nightmare. Among the debris was a journal, its pages yellowed and damp. My hands shook slightly as I picked it up, the leather cover cracked and worn. I flipped it open, my curiosity getting the better of me. The handwriting was neat at first, the kind of penmanship that spoke of care, but as I flipped through, it started to change. The entries started out normal enough, dates, notes about the weather, the beauty of the woods. But as I read further, the handwriting grew erratic, the words frantic. Mentions of whispers at night, of something following me. The last entry was short, almost illegible. They're close. I can feel them watching. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. I glanced around, the woods silent but for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I decided it was time to head back. But as I retraced my steps, something felt wrong. The trail markers I'd passed earlier were gone, or maybe moved. Each turn looked unfamiliar, each tree like the last. I told myself to stay calm, but the more I walked, the more I felt the woods were shifting around me, like they were alive, like they were playing a game I didn't understand. Then the sound started, faint at first, like distant whispers carried by the wind. They seemed to come from all around, echoing between the trees, impossible to pinpoint. My heart pounded as I picked up my pace, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Just as panic began to set in, I saw him again, the older man, standing in the middle of the path, his eyes locked on me. This time, there was no warning in his expression, only anger. "What did you see?" he demanded, stepping towards me. I stammered something about being lost, about just wanting to find my way back, but he kept advancing, his face twisted in rage. "You shouldn't have come this far," he hissed, reaching for something in his coat. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground, branches whipping against my face and arms as I tore through the undergrowth. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. I stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath, and that's when I saw it. A shallow pit, freshly dug, the earth piled loosely beside it. Something protruded from the dirt, something pale. My stomach turned as I realized what it was. A hand, fingers curled slightly, lifeless. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate. I spun around to see the older man again, but he wasn't alone this time. Two others flanked him, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoods. "You shouldn't have seen this," one of them said, their voice cold, devoid of emotion. They moved closer, surrounding me, and I knew I had to think fast. My mind raced, and then, without really knowing what I was doing, I blurted out, "People know I'm here. They're expecting me back. If I don't show up, they'll come looking." It was a bluff, a desperate lie, but it seemed to give them pause. The older man narrowed his eyes, his gaze searching mine as if trying to decide whether I was telling the truth. For a moment, everything was still, the woods holding its breath. Then, without a word, the man gestured to the others, and they stepped back, fading into the trees once more. "Get out," he growled, his voice barely more than a whisper, "and don't come back." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, not stopping until I saw the faint glimmer of sunlight through the thinning trees, until I stumbled out onto a familiar trail, my car just visible in the distance. It took me hours to calm down, to steady my hands enough to drive. When I got back to town, I went straight to the police. I told them everything about the campsite, the journal, the shallow grave. They listened, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Just another hiker who'd gotten spooked, they said. They sent a couple of officers out, but they found nothing. No grave, no journal, no sign of the men I'd seen. A few days later, I did some digging of my own. I found old articles, reports of people who'd gone missing in those woods, stories that never had an ending. There were whispers of a cult, of rituals deep in the forest, of secrets buried where no one would think to look. The older man, I realized, wasn't just some hermit. He was part of it, a gatekeeper, someone trying to keep their secrets hidden from the world. I haven't been back to the woods since. The thought of it makes my skin crawl, my chest tighten with fear. I still hike, but never alone, and never without telling someone exactly where I'm going. I learned the hard way that the wilderness isn't always a place of peace. Sometimes it's a place that doesn't want you to leave, a place that keeps its secrets close and its trespassers closer. Story 2. There are some choices you make that you never stop regretting, no matter how much time passes. My name is Sarah. I'm 25, a nursing student just trying to make it through endless study sessions and late-night cramming. It was a Thursday, and I had just left my friend's place after a long night of reviewing notes for an upcoming exam. I was tired, hungry, and all I wanted was to get home, curl up in bed, and forget the day ever happened. It was late, later than I'd intended, and I decided to take a shortcut, an unfamiliar back road through rural Pennsylvania. I remember glancing at my GPS, noting the winding route, and shrugging. It seemed fine, a way to shave off a few minutes. I never thought that a simple turn would lead me to question whether I'd ever see my family again. The road was dark, barely illuminated by my headlights, the only light coming from the moon above and the occasional glint off the reflective road markers. I had the radio playing softly, the DJ's voice comforting in the otherwise empty night. Everything seemed fine until I spotted it, an old car parked haphazardly on the side of the road, its driver and passenger doors both flung wide open. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. I slowed down instinctively, peering into the shadows, but there was no one in sight. Just an empty car, its interior lit by the dim glow of the dome light. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt an urge to just keep moving, so I did. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the fact that it was the only other vehicle I had seen in miles, or maybe it was just the sense that something was terribly wrong. I kept driving, my heart pounding a little harder than before, the empty road feeling more oppressive. It was then that I saw a faint glow in the distance, a gas station. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I figured I could stop, maybe get a snack, and shake off the creeping unease that had settled over me since seeing that abandoned car. The gas station was old, the kind with a single pump and a flickering neon sign that barely worked. I pulled in, my tires crunching over the gravel as I parked near the entrance. The lights inside were on, and I could see someone standing behind the counter, an older man, his eyes following me as I got out of the car. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, the air smelling faintly of dust and stale coffee. The man, the attendant, looked at me with a strange intensity, his eyes narrowing slightly as I approached. "Late night to be out here," he said, his voice low and raspy. I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just trying to get home," I replied, trying to sound casual. He asked where I was headed, and I hesitated for a moment before telling him the name of the town. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "Not many folks come through here anymore," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. Then, after a moment, he added, "You should be careful. Roads around here can get tricky at night." There was something in his tone, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I thanked him, grabbed a bottle of water, and quickly left. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder and I could see him still watching me through the grimy window. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was just a weird encounter, nothing more. I got back in my car and drove off, the gas station fading in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. I had barely driven for 10 minutes when I saw it, the road ahead completely blocked by fallen trees. They were large, old, and it didn't look like they had fallen naturally. My stomach sank as I slowed to a stop, the beam of my headlights illuminating the twisted branches and leaves. I cursed under my breath, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I heard it, the soft hiss of air escaping my tires. My heart dropped. I opened the door and stepped out, my feet crunching over the gravel as I crouched down to inspect the damage. There were spikes, metal spikes, barely visible, hidden beneath the fallen leaves. They had been placed there deliberately. Panic set in, my hands trembling as I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkened woods on either side of the road. That's when I saw them, figures moving between the trees, masked faces just barely visible in the shadows. They were watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my pulse quicken, a cold wave of fear washing over me. I tried to stay calm, to think, but every instinct was screaming at me to run. I knew I had to get out of there. I turned back to my car, but it was no use. The tires were completely shredded. The car wasn't going anywhere. I could hear them now, the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot as they moved closer. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the pavement as I sprinted towards the woods. The branches tore at my clothes, my heart hammering in my chest as I pushed further into the darkness, the sound of footsteps following close behind. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away, had to find somewhere to hide. That's when I saw it. A small, rundown hunting cabin, barely visible through the thick trees. I stumbled towards it, throwing myself against the door, my hands fumbling for the handle. It gave way, and I tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The cabin was dark, the air musty, and I could barely make out the shapes of old furniture covered in dust. I moved quickly, shoving a rickety chair under the doorknob, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I tried to listen, tried to hear if they were still following me. I could hear them outside, their footsteps circling the cabin, the creak of the old wooden porch as they stepped onto it. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall, my eyes darting around the room, searching for something, anything that I could use. My fingers brushed against an old metal lantern, and an idea formed, desperate and reckless. I grabbed it, throwing it across the room, the crash echoing through the small space. Then I moved, slipping through a back window, the wood scraping against my arms as I crawled out and dropped to the ground below. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I could hear them behind me, their shouts muffled by the blood pounding in my ears. The forest was a blur, the trees blending together as I pushed myself forward, branches whipping against my face. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. Headlights, bright and blinding, cutting through the darkness. I stumbled out onto the road, waving my arms, my voice cracking as I screamed for help. The car skidded to a stop, and the driver, a middle-aged woman, jumped out, her eyes wide with shock as she took in my disheveled state. She didn't ask questions, just opened the door and helped me inside. We drove away, the headlights of the trucks fading into the distance as I finally allowed myself to breathe. I told her everything, my voice shaking as I recounted what had happened, the fear still fresh in my mind. It wasn't until later, after the police arrived, that I learned the truth. The gas station attendant, the man who had watched me so intently, had tipped them off. He was part of it, part of a human trafficking ring that had been operating in the area for years. They targeted travelers, people who wouldn't be missed right away. The roadblocks, the spikes, it was all planned, a trap that I had stumbled into without even realizing it. My description helped the police, and eventually, they managed to bust the operation, to put an end to what was happening out there in the woods. But it didn't change what I had gone through, the fear that still lingers every time I drive at night. I never thought a simple wrong turn could change my life. I never thought I'd question whether I'd see my family again. But that night taught me something, that evil can hide in the most unexpected places, that sometimes the smallest decisions can lead you into darkness. And now, every time I see a back road, every time I think about taking a shortcut, I remember the woods, the masked figures, and the cabin that saved my life.